Digital Debate Center. Today we're going to be talking about evidence. What is it, how to use it, and how to not use evidence, somewhat paradoxically. Just as a quick reminder before we get into the lecture, we do have a couple debate tournaments coming up. Tomorrow we have an elementary school tournament. This Saturday we have a middle school, high school tournament at Best Academy. And then the following weekend on the 14th, we have a high school tournament, I believe, or middle school tournament at Druid Hills. So let's talk about evidence. So evidence is really simple. It's what we in debate call an extended quote from a source. And ideally, that source is going to be an expert, someone who can add some substance to the conversation. So why do we use evidence? What are the benefits? One of the benefits is credibility. Now, debaters are super smart, but someone who's been studying U.S.-China relations, for example, for 20 years is going to know a little bit more and be a bit more of a credible source to the judge when you're making a particular argument. Another benefit is going to be specificity / empirical support. So when I say empirical support, I mean if I want to determine how much money the U.S. State Department is selling weapons for, I can find an official report that will give me that information so I can make a specific claim that's not common knowledge. And then lastly, it's just going to make a stronger argument. It's going to be more detailed than an analytic argument, and it's going to be better organized. Now, when I talk about these benefits, note that it lends credibility to my argument. It helps me provide specific empirical support to my argument. It helps me have stronger warrants for my argument. So, what we're going to talk about today is evidence does not equal argument. In fact, most Atlanta Urban Debate League debaters misuse and overuse evidence. So what does that look like? You misuse evidence if you read evidence for most of your speech. These are the don't do's. If you're reading evidence for most of your speech, that's a little bit easier to read. If you only refer to evidence, not the argument. And the reason that's bad is because if you're only referring to the cup and moral evidence, and you're not saying the cup and moral evidence says that human rights are super important, then you're getting kind of lost in a word salad that the judge isn't really going to understand. And finally, if you read extra evidence before you explain what you already read. Debate is a game about managing your evidence, about using quotations and expert sources and expert analysis in order to strengthen your argument. If you're reading evidence for most of your speech, if you're only referring to the name of the evidence, not the argument it's making, if you start your speech off by reading a piece of evidence rather than explaining the evidence you've already read in the 1AC or the 1NC, you are misusing evidence. So what should we do instead? How should we be using evidence in a way that helps us explain what's going on? So first, we're going to use / leverage what we've already read. And what I mean by that is the 1NC / 1AC should contain most of the evidence that you're going to read in a debate. The rest of your time should be spent explaining and using that evidence. So how do I do that? This is what's called extending an argument. Now you might think, well, there's stuff in the packet. If they say, and I'm reading the normal kind of novice affirmative, the risk index affirmative, if they say that Saudi Arabia is going to buy from Russia, there's a piece of evidence that I have to use to respond. That's not necessarily true. So how do we extend and leverage the evidence we've already read? First, we want to identify the evidence that we've read by name in terms of site, and also by argument. Extend 1AC Thrall and Dormini, the solvency evidence. Extend 1AC Cup and Moro, the human rights impact. By not only giving the name of the evidence, but also the argument it makes, you're giving context to the judge. Next, we're going to explain our evidence. And what I mean by that is we're going to list out the warrants. Now remember, evidence is helpful because it gives us credibility and specific empirical support. So if my evidence is from someone who's super qualified, I want to say that here. If my evidence has a specific empirical number about the number of countries, for example, that the United States is selling weapons to, I'm going to put that in here. And the reason I want to put that in here is because it allows me to make arguments. I once judged a debate in which the 1AR made an argument, and the entirety of the argument was only referenced to evidence citation names. It went something like, extend the 1AC Jones evidence, which answers the 1MC Murillo evidence, which answers back by the 2AC whatever evidence. Nobody understands what that person just said. We want to make sure we're making arguments. We're not just reading evidence. Next thing you want to do is then answer your opponent's argument. It's not enough to say what your evidence says. You have to make it interact with your opponent. And that gets us to the idea of evidence comparison. So how can I compare my argument, the evidence I'm reading, to my opponent's argument? When was it published? That's something. If there's a new CAP policy that was created in 2018, and the 1AC inherency evidence is from 2017, there's a bit of a problem, right? Because the 1AC evidence does not assume current U.S. Direct commercial sales policy. Who wrote the evidence? Is it a civil rights activist writing on commondreams.org? Is it someone who has a PhD in political science? These are all points of comparison that you can make. Next, we want to get into the warrants. Does your evidence cite empirics in terms of historical examples or something like that? Does it assume your opponent's argument? And there are a variety of things that we can do. This is not an exclusive list. But what's important is that we're extending on arguments, identifying support for that argument, and then explaining how my argument interacts with my opponent's arguments. So you might be thinking, well, I know about evidence. I know how to use evidence. I'm reading evidence. I'm winning debates. Why do I care? So why does this matter? One, the judge. There's a very important part of the debate, as it turns out, because the judge is going to vote for you or not vote for you. Policy debate is very technical. We read long quotations. Oftentimes, newer debaters and newer judges are going to be confused. So properly making arguments using evidence instead of just reading evidence is going to help adapt to new judges. And you might be thinking, well, why should I have to adapt to these new judges? They should be learning more about debate. And I agree. Unfortunately, we can't always get what we want, and we need to help the judge interpret our arguments, because otherwise, they're going to drop you. They're not going to vote for you because they're not going to understand what you said. Next, it increases your speaker points. If you're not just reading evidence, but you're making arguments and you're leveraging research, that's really smart. It makes you sound smart. It makes you sound credible. It makes you sound like you know what you're talking about. That's going to increase your speaker points, which will help you face easier opponents. But moreover, it'll help you at the end of the tournament when you might get a speaker award. Next, you will be the exception to the norm. You'll be the exception. Most people just read evidence in debates. They don't explain it. They don't say why it matters. They don't say why it helps them win the debate. They don't explain the argument it's making. They just reference evidence out of nowhere. If you're the exception to that, then you're going to make a really good impression on your judge, which is really going to help you win. And then finally, you'll be making better arguments, which again helps persuade the judge. Why will you be making better arguments? Because you'll be taking someone who's an expert in the field, and you'll be understanding their arguments, understanding why they're making the conclusions they make, why they make the political recommendations they make, which means that you will be taking someone who has a lot of experience and you'll be learning from them. So you'll be referencing lots of specific arguments made by experts, which means that you'll get better at debate. So there's a limited amount of evidence in the packet. So the question then becomes, if evidence helps me make arguments, and I have a limited amount of evidence, how can I make arguments without evidence, which is what we're going to focus on for the rest of the time here. So the next half of this is going to be about analytic arguments. What is an analytic argument? It is an argument that does not cite / quote a source. We don't include these in the packet for the most part. Instead, this is an opportunity for you to make some smart arguments. So why is an analytic argument useful? The first thing we're going to do is it's going to allow us to diversify our arguments. For example, the Taiwan war advantage. The only negative responses are that US-China war won't happen. But we could come up with some analytic arguments to make sure that we're not just making no impact claims, we're also making insolvency claims, non-unique claims, stuff like that. So it's going to be diversify, and we're also going to multiply the number of arguments we make. Where are we going to be multiplying the number of arguments that we make? The reason is because a piece of evidence takes a long time to read. But I can say their evidence is incredible, or I read a news article recently that said X, or their election decide doesn't assume that the House is going to file articles of impeachment. Just by reading the news, I can make more short arguments that are different, and I can kind of catch my opponents by surprise. It also allows us to use independent research. Oftentimes, when we release the packet, the evidence is representative of the controversy, the state of Taiwan, for example, the state of the election, of Trump's re-election campaign, at the particular point in time when we are releasing them. But if you read the news, you can reference what a normal person who is politically aware would know. You can reference common knowledge. So you have some uniqueness evidence for the elections DA, the argument that the plan would help Trump get reelected. You could read that, sure, in the 2AC, or you could say, I was reading the news and Pelosi just gave the okay to file articles of impeachment against Trump. That means there's no way he gets reelected. And then your opponent can't just read evidence anymore, right? They have to think on the spot to determine a response to the argument you're making. The third reason we want to use analytics is something called Occam's razor. So in debate, we have these very convoluted explanations as to how things lead to nuclear war. We have these long causal chains where we're predicting out months or years or decades in advance how a particular political scenario will play out. Occam's razor says the simplest explanation is the best explanation. So instead of saying, well, the US and China are at odds because of trade, we concede Taiwan, which helps relations. That helps us have better trade negotiations, which means those trade negotiations will be successful, which means that the global economy won't collapse, which means that years in the future there won't be a civil war in the developing parts of Africa. That's a really long explanation. A simpler analytic argument to answer that scenario might be, there's no reason why countries that are really focused on economic interdependence would care at all about Taiwan when negotiating about trade. Very simple argument. And me just reading through the scenario of my opponent can just come up with stuff. So how does this help me? Let's think about that judge again. So if your opponents are reading a lot of evidence, they're talking about the Thrall Dormini answers the Kappenmora, which says this and this and this, it gets really complicated. Analytics helps simplify and explain the debate. Which brings me to another thing that's important. Analytic arguments, or arguments without evidence, help tell the judge what is going on in the debate. So you perhaps been told, and if you haven't been told this one, I'm telling you now, that you should give reasons why you won the debate at the end of the debate. You should say, first, our disadvantage is more important than the benefits of the plan. Second, there's low risk of the affirmative advantage, but a high risk of our impact. Third, our evidence is higher quality. Now that's all well and good, but you should be doing that, narrating the debate as it's happening throughout the entirety of the debate. Say, now let's talk about the disadvantage. Our evidence is much better here, Judge, which means you should find our arguments more credible. You're narrating the debate, you're explaining what's happening as it's happening. Now you can do that less with more experienced judges, but with judges who don't really know what's going on, or judges who are new, that type of narration and giving context to arguments and explaining what those arguments mean is crucial to helping them connect the dots and vote for you. You don't want to receive a ballot that says, well, your opponent's made better eye contact, which means you have to tell the judge how to vote. How is that going to be done? It's going to be done with analytic arguments. How does this help you with the judge? You sound smart. Because the other team is very dependent upon pre-made research. You're innovating, right? People who judge have heard the same packet 100 times by the end of the year. If you make an argument that's new and that's different, instead of following along and just being like, oh, they're reading that piece of evidence again, they're going to really listen to you. So you want to be smart and innovative. The other thing it can help with for the judge is to reduce jargon. When we were talking about how to extend a piece of evidence, I said you need to identify the citation, you need to reference the internal warrants, you need to do evidence comparison. Oftentimes judges can get lost in the micro of that and lose track of the big picture. So you can cut through jargon by just saying, look, they talk a lot about the US economy being harmed or the US manufacturing sector being harmed. The trade war has hurt the US economy way more than not selling one particular type of plane to Taiwan. It's just not going to matter. And those arguments really attract the attention of judges because it's jargonless. You're just explaining and speaking the truth. So when should I use analytics? The answer is almost every speech, but I want to pinpoint a particular or some different ways we can use it. Use analytics. So first, in the 1NC, we want to be using analytics to answer the case. Read through the 1AC and say, here are 5 things that just occur to me as I'm reading this about how this doesn't make sense. Force your opponents to explain their argument, not just be on rails. What I mean by that is a train just follows along and it only goes on one path. You want to be smarter than that. In the 2AC, you want to be doing this for off case. What's a problem with the disadvantage? You can think of a myriad of problems. It's non-unique. The impact evidence isn't that good. If someone's reading the critique, you can say, well, actually, this is all just hogwash. And you can make some analytic arguments to explain why the structural concerns of militarism don't answer the particular micro-level political problem that the AF isolates. So for off case, you want to do that. And then in the 2NR/2AR, you want to be focusing on doing impact calculus, which I've talked about a lot, whose impact is more important. Are the benefits of the plan more important than the costs? Obviously, the app and egg disagree about that. But also giving voters, why did I win the debate? Judge, you're going to write 3 things on the ballot at the end of this debate. First, our evidence was higher quality. Second, the disadvantage was not really answered by the 1AR. Third, there is no case because the 1AR made this mistake. And then one other thing that I want to point out is this is a great opportunity to talk about mistakes that your opponent has made. Now, don't just be like, they didn't answer cross-ex question. It's over. It's not. But if they don't answer one of your arguments, or they can make a concession, or they're extending a piece of evidence that they didn't read earlier in the debate, analytic arguments are an opportunity for us to talk about that. So at the end of the day, ultimately, when we're talking about evidence and analytics, evidence helps us make arguments, right? Because it gives us credibility, it gives us specific empirical support, and it provides us with longer, more in-depth expert analysis. But ultimately, evidence is not enough to win a debate. You have to frame and narrate the debate with analytic arguments. So what I hope you've learned today is that evidence is not an argument in and of itself. You have to use your evidence to make arguments and win the debate. And second, in a world where everyone has the same evidence, analytic arguments can help us be better at debate because we can make smart, innovative arguments that our opponents haven't thought of yet. So that's it for today. I'd be happy to answer any questions.